the Marquis de Sade. The mere mention of his name resonates like a chilling verdict, an echo of the most horrific taboos. It instantly conjures images of unthinkable perversions, monstrous tortures, and the bottomless darkness of the human soul. But is this figure truly so simple? Was he merely a madman confined to the dungeons of history? Or does something more profound lie hidden behind the myths? A prophet, a philosopher whose ideas, however horrifying, anticipated an entire era? Born in Paris on June 2, 1740, Donatien Alphonse François de Sade came from a noble, though not the most influential branch of the French aristocracy. His father was Count Jean-Baptiste François-Joseph de Sade, and his mother was Marie-Éléonore de Maillet. From a very young age, sent first to be raised by his uncle, an abbé, and then to the rigorous Jesuit Collège Louis le Grand, young Donatien absorbed not only a classical education and Enlightenment ideas, but also the rebellious, indomitable spirit of his lineage. At the age of 14, he entered military service, distinguishing himself with bravery in the 7 Years' War, where he rose to the rank of captain in a dragoon regiment. It seemed a path to a brilliant career, public recognition, and perhaps even political influence lay open before him. However, upon his return from the war in 1763, de Sade swiftly veered off the predetermined path, opting instead for the dark labyrinths of human passions. His marriage to Renée-Pélagie de Montreuil, the daughter of a wealthy judge, was intended to solidify his financial standing and ensure stability, but it instead became merely a backdrop for a series of shocking scandals that rocked high society and forever stained his name. The Marquis, unconstrained by the bounds of propriety and morality, plunged headfirst into a maelstrom of debauchery, transgressing all conceivable and inconceivable limits, exploring the forbidden corners of sexuality and power. The first major incident, the so-called Arcueil affair, erupted in 1768. A young prostitute named Rose Keller accused the Marquis of kidnapping, brutal beating, and forcing her into blasphemous acts and depraved rituals. Although she managed to escape and de Sade was arrested on a royal warrant, his influential in-laws secured his release by leveraging all their connections. This was merely a prelude to far darker events. In 1772 in Marseille, de Sade, along with his valet, found himself at the center of an even more monstrous scandal. 4 young women, invited to his villa, claimed they were drugged with powerful aphrodisiacs, brutally beaten, and subjected to unthinkable sexual abuse. Accusations of poisoning, sodomy, and attempted murder led to a death sentence in absentia, issued by the Parliament of Aix-en-Provence. The Marquis was forced to flee, and his effigy was publicly burned in the town square, an unprecedented act of disgrace for an aristocrat. But even this public humiliation and the threat of death did not deter him. Returning to France, he took refuge in his Château de Lacoste, in the secluded lands of Provence, where he continued his experiments, transforming it into a sort of theater for his orgies, philosophical discussions, and plays. He himself acted as director and performer, compelling his servants and guests to participate in the wildest fantasies. His behavior grew increasingly provocative, and accusations of cruelty, violence, and inhumane treatment multiplied. He was hunted, and his name became synonymous with vice and absolute depravity. And so, in 1777, after another escape and subsequent arrest, the Marquis de Sade was cast into the Château de Vincennes. Thus began his nearly 13-year period of imprisonment without trial, by direct royal decree, the infamous lettre de cachet. From Vincennes he was transferred to the Bastille, then to Charenton, and back to the Bastille. He became not merely a prisoner, but a symbol of monarchical arbitrariness and, simultaneously, the embodiment of the forbidden, dark impulse. Within the prison walls, deprived of freedom, he found another space for his rebellion, paper and pen. It was there, in captivity, that he began to create the texts that centuries later would evoke shock, revulsion, and, surprisingly, deep philosophical contemplation, forcing the world to confront its own hidden desires and fears. A popular myth portrays the Marquis de Sade merely as a maniac, a sexual pervert whose life was a series of crimes, and whose work was a pathological delirium unworthy of attention. But this image is merely a convenient caricature, designed to simplify and devalue a figure who was, in reality, far more multifaceted and perhaps far more dangerous to the foundations of his time than commonly believed. He was not merely a libertine. He was a systemic destroyer whose actions and words, whether conscious or not, challenged the morality, religion, and very structure of the society that bore him and then rejected him, forever altering the perception of what is permissible in art and thought. Instead of merely accepting the labels affixed by history, we must delve into the profound origins that shaped such a contradictory figure. What forces intertwined within his soul, pushing the Marquis de Sade beyond all conceivable norms into the darkest corners of the human psyche? His seemingly privileged childhood was, in fact, woven from emotional alienation and rigid control. The son of a count, he grew up seeing little of his father, Jean-Baptiste François Joseph, who preferred social life and his own whims to family duties. His mother, Marie-Éléonore, was cold and distant, failing to provide her son with the unconditional love that might have softened his inherently indomitable nature. The emotional void left by his parents was filled by his uncle, the Abbé de Sade, an educated but strict man whose guardianship, while providing an excellent classical education, did not compensate for the lack of genuine affection. This was followed by the rigorous Jesuit Collège Louis le Grand, a bastion of Catholic dogma and strict discipline. Here, amidst pedantry and hypocrisy, young Donatien not only absorbed Enlightenment ideas, but also observed the duplicity so characteristic of the dying old regime. This clash between proclaimed ideals and hidden vices, between strict morality and actual arbitrariness, deeply imprinted itself on his consciousness, sowing the seeds of distrust and contempt for all forms of authority and official virtue. He learned to analyze, but his analysis led not to acceptance, but to radical negation. At the age of 14, when other boys were still playing with toy soldiers, de Sade entered military service, plunging into the brutal world of the 7 Years' War. Battlefields drenched in blood, ruined cities, anonymous deaths, all of this became for him not merely a backdrop, but a harsh school of life. He witnessed how violence became a legitimate tool, how human life was devalued for the sake of political ambitions, and how power reigned supreme over body and soul. This experience, gained at such a young and impressionable age, undoubtedly influenced his perception of the world, reinforcing his conviction in the fundamental cruelty of human nature and the arbitrary power of the strong over the weak. War, with its absolute absence of morality on the battlefield, was perhaps the first place where he saw the true face of human power, ruthless and merciless. His return to civilian life in 1763 and subsequent marriage to Renée-Pélagie de Montreuil, the daughter of a wealthy judge, were meant to secure his status and financial stability. But for de Sade, already bearing the imprint of war and Jesuitical duality, this became merely another trap of societal conventions, which he was prepared to explode from within. He did not seek peace. He craved extremes, and his initial shocking scandals were no accident. They became acts of defiant rebellion, a conscious, albeit impulsive, self-assertion in defiance of everything that constrained him. The Rose Keller affair in 1768, where a young prostitute accused him of kidnapping and torture, was not merely a crime. It was his first public challenge to society, a test of its boundaries. The fact that his influential in-laws managed to secure his release from arrest, using all their connections, only reinforced his dangerous delusion of impunity, that rules were not for him, but only for mediocrities. This gave him carte blanche for further, even more audacious experiments. However, it was the Marseille incident in 1772 that became the true point of no return. The accusations of poisoning, sodomy, and attempted murder, which led to a death sentence in absentia and the public burning of his effigy in the town square, were not just a legal fiasco or social disgrace. This marked a total symbolic expulsion from the world of propriety, an act of definitive rejection, after which there was no turning back to a respectable life. Society officially declared him a monster, and he, it seems, embraced this role, determined to push it to its absolute limits. Confined to his Château de Lacoste, away from condemning gazes, he ceased to be merely an aristocratic libertine hiding his vices. He transformed his estate into a true laboratory where the boundaries of what was permissible blurred, and experiments on body and soul evolved into a perverted yet coherent philosophy. These events, a series of public humiliations, legal persecutions, and a sense of absolute isolation, did not break him. On the contrary, they hardened him, transforming him into an implacable enemy of the very society that had rejected him. De Sade did not merely indulge his desires. He systematically dismantled everything considered sacred, using violence, blasphemy, and sexual deviations as weapons against the hypocritical foundations that, in his view, merely masked humanity's true, cruel nature. He became a living embodiment of the idea that an abyss lies hidden behind the facade of respectability, and his life, with its shocking acts, was a demonstration of this abyss, a challenge to its acknowledgement, rather than simply a crime. He was not merely insane, he was both a product and a curse of his century, a mirror reflecting its most unseemly features. But this mirror reflected not only the Marquis's personality, but also the era itself, which was rotting from within, rapidly approaching a point of no return. The 18th century, seemingly brilliant with the lights of the Enlightenment and faith in reason, was in reality a time of profound contradictions and escalating chaos, fertile ground for the most radical ideas and actions. France, whose crown had proudly stood over Europe for centuries, was by the 1770s crumbling under the weight of accumulated problems. The absolute monarchy, once a symbol of power, had become an archaic, cumbersome machine, detached from the needs of its people. The royal court in Versailles reveled in unprecedented luxury, festivities, and intrigues, while millions of French citizens outside its walls barely made ends meet. The economic situation was catastrophic. Exorbitant expenditures on countless wars, the extravagance of the aristocracy, and an imperfect tax system that primarily burdened the peasantry and bourgeoisie brought the country to the brink of bankruptcy. Hunger riots erupted across the nation, bread prices skyrocketed, and popular discontent grew like a snowball. The privileged estates, the nobility and the clergy, enjoyed their exemptions, freed from most taxes, while the majority of the population lived in poverty and disenfranchisement. This blatant injustice corroded the social fabric, sowing anger and despair. Simultaneously, Enlightenment ideas, like a powerful hurricane, swept through minds, undermining centuries-old foundations. Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, their works, celebrating reason, liberty, and human rights, spread with incredible speed, questioning the divine right of kings, the authority of the church, and the very hierarchy of society. People began to think critically, demand change, and recognize their rights. Philosophers called for the overthrow of tyranny, for equality before the law, for justice, and these appeals resonated deeply in the hearts of those who had suffered for years under the oppression of the old regime. The social atmosphere was permeated with hypocrisy. The official morality preached by the church and the court sharply contrasted with the actual lifestyle of the elite. Sexual promiscuity, intrigues, corruption, and cruelty were commonplace behind the closed doors of luxurious mansions, while publicly, strict adherence to propriety and ostentatious virtue were demanded. This gap between word and deed, between outward piety and hidden debauchery, created an atmosphere of cynicism and nihilism, especially among those who witnessed this double game from within. Old dogmas lost their power, new ones had not yet taken root, and in this moral vacuum, the boldest, and at times most monstrous, experiments with the boundaries of what was permissible flourished. Thus, the Marquis de Sade was not an isolated phenomenon. He lived in an era when the old world was slowly but surely dying, taking with it centuries-old notions of morality, power, and human nature. This was a time when social and political structures were undergoing a profound crisis, when intellectual currents challenged every pillar of society, and when the hypocrisy of the elite reached its zenith. Such a climate created an ideal, fertile ground for any affair, be it a revolution, a scientific discovery, or, as in de Sade's case, a radical, shocking reinterpretation of human sexuality and morality, taken to its absolute extreme. The society that bore him was as sick and contradictory as the Marquis himself, and his life became merely one of the most vivid and terrifying symptoms of this illness. Unsurprisingly, after the disgraceful Marseille verdict and his flight, when his effigy burned in the square and his name was forever stained, the Marquis de Sade did not seek redemption. On the contrary, his indomitable nature, as if driven by some inner necessity, continued to test the boundaries of what was permissible, delving into new, even darker experiments. In April 1773, after a daring escape from Mialan's fortress, where he was held for the Marseille affair, de Sade sought refuge in Savoy. But even there, his presence did not go unnoticed. Soon, new, no less shocking accusations were brought against him: violence and sodomy against a young stable boy named Latour, as well as the torture of a certain Mademoiselle Lacoste. These new acts once again led to an arrest warrant, forcing the Marquis into another flight, this time to his Provençal estate, Château de Lacoste. Château de Lacoste, already mentioned as his refuge after the Marseille incident, became a true citadel of debauchery and cruelty. Here, away from prying eyes and, as he believed, from justice, the Marquis, wielding his absolute power over servants and invited guests, pushed his perverse fantasies to their limits. This period, lasting from 1773 to 1777, was a time of unprecedented escalation of his outrages. He even involved relatives in his orgies and tortures, specifically his wife's sister, Anne Prosper de Launay, turning her into one of his victims and accomplices. Rumors of what transpired within Lacoste's walls, of unthinkable acts of violence, blasphemy, and even, according to some accounts, black magic, quickly spread throughout the region, provoking not only horror, but also growing indignation. Local residents, peasants, and the lesser nobility, already weary of aristocratic arbitrariness, began to openly express their discontent, and the parents of the deceived and tormented girls persistently demanded justice. It was these multiplying complaints and public pressure, intensified by the tireless efforts of his mother-in-law, Madame de Montreuil, who was determined to rein in her son-in-law and save the family's honor, that led to the inevitable conclusion. In 1777, almost 5 years after the Marseille verdict, the Marquis de Sade was arrested again, this time in Paris, where he had traveled on business. This arrest, carried out by a royal lettre de cachet, the infamous letter with a seal, that allowed the king to imprison anyone without trial or due process, was not merely another episode in his tumultuous life. It was a direct intervention by the absolute monarchy, demonstrating its power over the individual, but simultaneously its weakness in the face of growing chaos. For de Sade, however, it marked the beginning of a nearly 13-year period of confinement that forever changed his destiny and, paradoxically, paved the way for the immortality of his ideas. The arrest in Paris and the royal lettre de cachet were not the end of his rebellious path, but merely a change of scenery, for the Marquis de Sade's will remained unyielding. Even before his incarceration, in his scandalous but free life, the Marquis demonstrated a remarkable ability to manipulate, creating an atmosphere of almost absolute submission around him. He did not merely compel his victims by force. He skillfully played on their weaknesses, using his aristocratic charm, promises of wealth, social advancement, or simply adventure. Young women such as Rose Keller or those in Marseille were often vulnerable, seeking a better lot or easy money, and de Sade expertly exploited these desires, offering them a world that seemed to be an escape from routine, but in reality turned into a nightmare. His Provençal estate, Lacoste, transformed into a meticulously directed theater of perversions. Here, he was the absolute conductor, selecting not only the performers, servants, invited guests, even relatives like his wife's sister, but also the props and the script. He created a closed world where his rules were the only valid ones, where moral and social norms were completely abolished. His valet, as well as other close associates, became not just accomplices, but also experts in his dark rituals, ensuring the logistics and execution of the boldest fantasies. De Sade possessed a unique gift for identifying hidden desires and suppressed vices in people and using them to achieve his goals, forming a circle of devoted, or at least intimidated and dependent followers around him. He masterfully created a sense of exclusivity, a kind of secret society where only the chosen could enter, which heightened their willingness to participate in his experiments. When the doors of the Château de Vincennes, and later the Bastille, closed behind him, depriving him of physical freedom and control over his surroundings, the Marquis de Sade did not break. On the contrary, his indomitable spirit found a new, no less powerful instrument for expressing his ideas and desires. Deprived of the ability to actualize his fantasies in real life, he transferred them to paper. Every line, every word became an act of rebellion, a means of sublimating his insatiable passions and philosophical reflections. Pen and ink became his new chains, binding not his body but his thoughts, forcing them into a form he could control and perfect. He wrote with maniacal obsession, creating vast manuscripts that would later become his most powerful legacy, shocking and provocative. The prison walls could not silence his voice. They merely forced it to resonate anew, transforming personal perversions into a universal, albeit horrifying, manifesto on the nature of human freedom and power. He adapted to total control, turning isolation into an ideal environment for the boundless flight of the most dangerous of all tools, thought. His imprisonment, initiated by royal decree, was not merely an act of justice or arbitrariness, but the result of a relentless, almost fanatical struggle waged by one woman, his mother-in-law, Madame de Montreuil. For this authoritative and unyielding aristocrat, her son-in-law's name became an unbearable disgrace, a stain on her family's seemingly impeccable reputation. She saw him not just as a debauchee, but as a threat capable of destroying everything she had built. Her primary goal, beyond saving the family's honor, was to shield her daughter, Renée-Pélagie, from the Marquis's detrimental influence as he continued to hold her in his orbit despite all the scandals. Renée-Pélagie de Montreuil, the Marquis's wife, found herself at the center of this family maelstrom, like a hostage on a taut string. Despite the public humiliation, monstrous accusations, and undeniable evidence of her husband's cruelty, she displayed astonishing resilience and a strange, almost pathological devotion. She visited him in prisons, Vincennes, the Bastille, Charenton, wrote petitions, sought his release, interceded for him with influential figures, and even most paradoxically, provided him with books and paper. These actions, inadvertently contributing to the development of his literary genius, were a mixture of genuine affection, fear of her mother's wrath, which could deprive her of everything, and perhaps a certain perverse pride in her extraordinary, albeit horrifying, husband. She was simultaneously a victim and an unwitting accomplice, a hostage and a defender, whose fate became inextricably linked with that of this dark genius. However, it was her mother, Madame de Montreuil, who remained the primary antagonist in this drama. Her relentless will became the true driving force behind the Marquis's long imprisonment. She did not merely seek his arrest, she demanded indefinite confinement, utilizing an instrument that symbolized the arbitrary power and hypocrisy of the old regime, the famous lettre de cachet. This royal letter, bearing the king's seal, allowed the monarch to arrest and imprison anyone without trial or due process, often at the request of influential families wishing to dispose of undesirable relatives without airing their dirty laundry publicly and avoiding a scandal that could undermine their standing. The system, designed to maintain order in the crown's authority, was here used to conceal family disgrace, demonstrating the cynicism of a power willing to overlook real crimes for the sake of preserving a facade of propriety and elite stability. His aristocratic origin, which initially served as a powerful shield, allowing him to evade severe punishment for his early transgressions, ultimately turned against him. The society he so audaciously provoked could not permit such a scandal to spread beyond aristocratic circles and tarnish their image. The lettre de cachet was an ideal solution for those in power. It removed the problem from public view without creating a dangerous precedent of a public trial for a high-ranking nobleman, which could undermine the monarchy's authority and fuel popular discontent. Thus, the very system that protected him eventually consumed him, but did so in a way that did not break him, but merely redirected his destructive energy from the external world to the internal. The privileges conferred by his birth became for de Sade not only a pass to impunity, but also a catalyst for his downfall. He was a product of a system that allowed the chosen few to commit outrages as long as they remained in the shadows. When his actions became too egregious, too public, this same system, to preserve its own image, was forced to isolate him. Yet, even in confinement, de Sade continued to use his patrons, albeit unwitting ones, but critically important for his survival and creativity. The royal treasury paid for his upkeep, providing him with basic living conditions, and the prison administration, though controlling him, could not entirely deprive him of access to writing materials. These seemingly minor details became crucial for the formation of his legacy, providing him not only refuge from the outside world, but also, paradoxically, the tools to express his rebellion. It was within these walls, under the pressure of Madame de Montreuil's relentless will, the merciless apparatus of royal power, and his wife's paradoxical but salvific devotion, that the Marquis de Sade, deprived of the outside world, found a different kind of freedom. He was forced to articulate his darkest fantasies and his radical ideas about human nature and society into words. His imprisonment, intended as a means of subjugation, turned into an unwitting laboratory where texts were born that would shake the world far more profoundly than any of his lifetime scandals, and forever alter the perception of the boundaries of thought and literature.